This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to another episode. Today's ChangeMaker is Adrianne Todman. Adrianne created an award-winning model to house homeless veterans as the executive director of the DC Housing Authority. Today, Adrianne is the CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. She leads a group of nearly 20,000 housing and community development agencies and professionals who house 8 million people throughout the country. Adrianne, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for the invitation to do this.
First of all, why do you love working in affordable housing?
What's there not to love in many ways? I think that it's a difficult job, whether you're developing affordable housing or you're managing affordable housing or you are thinking about the issues around affordable housing. It is a complex issue, but there's so much just gratification that comes with the impact of that work. Whether you are the person figuring out what a new policy should be, whether you are working with your residents on a program that helps them achieve some of their potential, whether you're handing someone their homeownership keys for the first time or a voucher for the first time. Quite frankly, even if you're in a meeting being yelled at by a community on why affordable housing matters, there's so much levels of gratification built on hope that being inside the affordable housing space gives to anybody who's there.
Home ownership is something that many people say is one of the platforms to advance people economically. And I think I read when you were in DC at the Housing Authority there, you created programs, furthered programs, I believe it was by increasing home ownership by 50% and substantially increased the volume, the number of affordable housing units that were available. Tell us how you did that, because I know so many people struggle with achieving home ownership, but then also agencies struggle to deliver it. So just give us a couple of sneak peeks here on how you made that happen.
The key part was of course, the physical environment, the housing itself. But I always thought about why is this housing important to this community? And if someone was in the voucher program, I worked with the team there to really expand the number of opportunities that families had to use vouchers for homeownership opportunity, which of course the tenant-based voucher program can be used to advance. And we really just bumped up that program and expanded it and put some resources in it. But then we did something that was even more intentional, which was we were also developing housing, either on our own or with our development partners. And we wanted to make sure that the families that we were working with had opportunities to some of the products that we built, particularly products that were targeting to lower and moderate income families, and just to make that hard match. And we had a number of families in the voucher program as well who did excellent jobs finding housing on their own, either here or in the suburbs nearby. So part of it is just realizing the impact of the work is, yes, to make sure people have housing, but also how do we use all the programs we have to help advance families and to create some kind of upward mobility.
You know, I've taken a tour through some of those neighborhoods, and I've been personally familiar with some of those neighborhoods in DC, and the before and after pictures are just remarkable. But I can anticipate that there was a lot of community pressure and political pressure in the beginning of those developments where people were either skeptical or they weren't trustful, or maybe they had seen some failed attempts previously. So, any tips for communities still struggling
Yeah,
in that space?
yeah. When I look back at all of the communities that were reimagined, repositioned, revitalized, however we want to describe it, there is always the arc of the experience. So, and the most difficult part of the arc sometimes is at the beginning where it's hard to convince people to trust you have their best interest at heart. I mean, that's really hard, particularly for a population who has very little reason to trust anyone, quite frankly, given how different systems have failed them. So that upfront work, though, is critical. Now, what I would tell people all the time is, I don't trust me, trust the documents. You know,
Mhm.
we're gonna do what we say, but we're gonna say it in a way that there's accountability at the end of the day. And there's just a lot of education over and over again. Here's what it means: visiting other sites, talking to other families who've been down the same journey. And then, quite frankly, the easiest part, and for our developers out there, they'll say, well, the easiest part is sometimes just getting the money together. When you talk about the humanity around the experience, right? You struggle, you finance, you create layers of different funds, local and federal, to make these deals work. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it takes months, but we get that part done. And the other side of the arc is designing a community that in some situations would not have opted to live next to each other if it were not an opportunity for high income folks to really just live in Washington, D.C. And what do I mean by that? Part of reimagining communities is how to improve the diversity of the community itself. We want to bring back families who once lived in a community. That's first and foremost something that should be done. But you also want to give housing opportunities to maybe some working class, middle class families where this is their ability to find affordable housing. And I found that sometimes, just as much as the beginning of the arc was difficult in shaping the ability to move forward, that back end experience, working with families to become one community, was sometimes just as challenging, because now you're dealing with people figuring out how to be neighbors and learning from each other, and building from strengths while not looking at others' weaknesses.
Well, and the strength of diversity and, is something that every business, every community, we're all right now trying to sort through exactly how that happens. In some regards, housing has been, striving for that for quite some time now, hasn't it? There are still setbacks, but, this is part of the beauty of what everybody has known or is now learning right now in
Mhm.
society, right? And along that vein, there was, I believe, William Julius Wilson. He's
Mhm.
a famous sociologist, and he wrote a book, Power, Racism, and Privilege, and another about more than just race, being Black and poor in the inner city. But he invited you to speak on a panel. And one of the things that you said was that public housing has not failed. You went through a series of discussions about policy and funding and formulas and community. And tell us exactly why you believe this, because there are many of us who are not able to articulate that. So, what
Right.
is it that has not failed about public housing?
First say that I have always been a student of Dr. William Julius Wilson, and I randomly reached out to him, this was a little bit a while ago, when I was still at the Housing Authority, and said, we're doing really cool things. It'd be great if you can come and just talk to us. You're brilliant and wonderful, and he said yes, and that led to a visit that was so gracious, just a visit he did with the senior staff and my board there to talk about his research and his thoughtfulness on issues around poverty and work and access to opportunity. And then from that led the invitation to speak at Harvard at a smaller group of individuals who cared about these issues and the intersect with of housing and poverty. And that was thrilling. And I'll always be grateful for that exposure to him directly, and the things that have shaped so many of our thoughts over the past several decades. I thought it was important to have the audience realize that there is this thing, this asset that is called public housing. We call it public housing. And it's the sticks and bricks, it's the units. But standing right next to this thing is the program. that is public housing. And I guess these days we can probably more easily decouple the two from each other because RAD is converting the units themselves into another program, right? But when these units were built, they were just as sturdy, just as strong as probably any housing that was built back in the 1930s and 40s. But what happened along the way is there was a decision to just not invest in these communities. Now, some people might say that decision may have been just based on money. Some people
Mm-hmm.
will say that decision was based on this image of who lives there
Yep.
and not wanting to invest in communities that house many Black and Brown people in different parts of the country, people who didn't care about poor people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's a motivation. We failed the buildings. The buildings in and of themselves did not fail. There was so many different, sometimes well-intended policies that were promulgated in the 60s and 70s that simply in hindsight didn't work the way that we intended to work. I think that looking back at the impact of going to an income-based rent did,
Mm-hmm.
again, not well intended, still makes sense in many ways. But when you look at the impact on the amount of money that was then placed into the operating system of these million or so units across the country, the math just didn't work. So then there was an operating subsidy, and that math didn't work. And there was a capital fund, and that math didn't work, right? And so it's human error. It's not the communities, it's not the buildings. And so to me, public housing as what it was intended to be, which is to create, to have housing for families. And we defined what those and who those families are over the decades. It didn't fail. We failed it.
I have so many questions right now just based upon what you just said. I mean, this is a great glimpse of where we are. And then my mind is running ahead to say, okay, well, what laws or regulations do you think we need now? Which is part of what your group is trying to do on a daily basis. So, first of all, let's start there. What regulations or laws do you think are needed in place to either fully support the national need or to address the supply?
So I think we definitely need to preserve what we have. We need to make sure that the units that are still standing stay standing and remain quality, affordable places for families to live. So that's number one. Number two is I do think that there's broader conversations we should have about the rule book of public housing. And I will say that many of our members are looking to RAD, not because they have some serious love affair with the Section 8 program, but the public housing program, it in and of itself can be difficult and quite frankly micromanaged from here in Washington, D.C. I think we should take a look at the way that rent is calculated. I do think that there's some embedded flaws, and one is just it's really difficult and has a lot of potential for mistakes along the way. But also, it doesn't necessarily always provide for opportunities for families to really engage in the economies of where they live in a way that is helpful. So if your rent goes up every time your income goes up, sometimes there might be decisions that are made that might counteract that. I'm not saying those decisions are made all the time. I'm saying that it adds in the equation of what can happen. And I'm not saying this out of theory. I'm saying this out of experience in having worked with families who over and over again will say, Ms. Todman, I have an adult child who lives with me. And that adult child has a great job. And now my adult child can't live with me anymore because, and they want to, I want them there, they want to be there because my rent's going to go. I mean, granted, that's the rule, but there's something, I have a 24-year-old daughter. And I would hate to think there would ever be a time, and she doesn't live with me, but I hate to think there ever be a time that I would feel that my child could not live with me because of that dynamic. And that's happened more than once and different scenarios like that. So I do think that there is some perfecting of
Mhm.
how we can look at. That's one area. And I do think that we can do a much better job of being comprehensive and long range about investing in our families and our youth. Sometimes investing in our families and youth has been haphazard, whether it's philanthropic in nature or whether it's a government program. There's nothing strong that says to, a 10-year-old who lives in public housing today, you know what? We are going to invest in you and wrap our arms around you so that you can graduate from high school, one, and you can make a decision that I want to go off to college, I want to learn a trade, I want to do all these things so that I don't have to live in public housing one day. I think that sometimes people say, oh my gosh, you can't say that people should. No, I think it is okay for a baby, a teenager, to say, I don't want to live in public housing. I want to have a different opportunity. And I think it is our obligation, writ large, to help that young person with that dream.
I just listened to some words that Kevin Hart was talking about, and he kept referring to, he said, I got out. I got out.
Right.
And he went through his success, but what drove him was his need to get out. And he felt this need to get out. But now he's at a point in his age where he's a little over 40. And he's saying, I've got to go back
Right.
and teach people in my neighborhood financial literacy and investments. And it's more than just the day to day. And so, that vision making really is difficult for people who are in certain communities or apartments. And so, I don't know, it seems like property managers, they're having to do their annual or interim recertification so
Right.
much that sometimes that those pieces of life get squeezed
And
out.
it's not their job, right? If you're a
Yeah.
property manager, your job is to manage the property, collect rent,
Yep.
be the
Yep.
compliant entity, but it's not necessarily to help make people's hopes and dreams come true. That's a whole different experience.
Right. So just thinking along that, what are some of the things that worry you the most about affordable housing?
So other than making sure that it's funded at the level that it needs to be, I would say the it gets back to my last comment, right? Which is particularly in light of the protests that we've seen, not just around this city and this country, but the world, that there is a hue and cry for something different, for something meaningful. I will say that there are many different races that and ethnicities that live in assisted housing, whether it is public housing or the Section 8 program, project and tenant based, many different races and ethnicities. But there is in some cities a preponderance of African Americans, West Indians, Asian people who feel trapped where they live. And that feeling comes from the failure of various different systems across the country, whether it is access to a good education, whether it's access to good health care, and sometimes, sadly, whether or not we've been keeping up with making sure their home itself is adequate and safe and sanitary. To me, what bothers me the most, what keeps me up at night, is the same thing that did when I first got into all of this, is how do we make this thing called affordable housing a platform for change for families who need it, who desire it, who wish for it? How do we do that? And that is a dream in and of itself that's unfulfilled. I don't think we've figured it out yet. I think it is haphazard. I think we have great successes in different places, but we haven't really done the investment and the care that we need to help families achieve their best potential. And so I think that yes, we need more supply of affordable housing, and that is the thing to say. We need more supply of affordable housing. We need more people who are skilled in building affordable housing to help with that supply. We need more financing tools. We need to perfect financing tools. But I also feel that for the families who are sometimes the most vulnerable, who, once they live in that housing, feel trapped. I think that there's a secondary obligation that we have.
Many times you'll hear people say that a zip code should not dictate the outcome of whatever your life is defined to be,
That's
whether
right.
that is healthcare or an education or ability to advance or home ownership, and that the zip code should not be the indicator of what level of access you have
Mhm.
and the barometer of what level of moving through any of those continuums. And I think that right now you see people saying, okay, so what do we do with that now?
Mhm.
So, do you want to give us any tips of what some of your members in your organization are doing to solve this?
Sure, sure. Well, of course, I think get back to the physical structure themselves. Many of our members, from the largest to the smallest, are actively looking at RAD as a tool, actively looking at just a little HUD Geek Section 18, the demo dispo rules, to reposition their sites and the choice program. So again, it comes down to basics. Let's make sure that the housing we have today is the housing we have tomorrow. And so many of them are being forward looking and making those investments at their sites. And that's certainly a lot. One of the things that we're also doing is we took a look at some old research that was done back in 2010 and brought it forward a little bit to say what is the capital backlog that is out there right now. And the math demonstrates that there's about a $70 billion backlog, and we receive not near that much each year in the capital fund so that units can be fixed. And we went to the Hill and we said, this is a big number. It's a bodacious number, but it's a real number. If you take a look at New York alone, I mean, they've suggested that their capital backlog is upwards of about $50 billion. So the other part is investing where it matters. And I think if there's anything that the pandemic has demonstrated to maybe just me, but perhaps others, is the ability of this United States of America to prioritize where it spends its money. And granted, we had a public health episode that impacted so many of us, but to me it's a lesson on when we care, when we think something matters, we know how to rise to the occasion. So $70 billion is a drop in the hat if the idea is to really shore up what are probably generations of families who would need that housing as a platform for success in their lives. We're also working with our members on the services that they do. We are continually advocating for those services that HUD runs, but we're also making sure that members learn from each other about building strong partnerships that are outcome based in their localities, whether it is on healthcare interventions or education interventions. And I mean, I could go on and on, but I'll stop there for now.
So far in the first part of our chat, you've mentioned you've testified before Congress. You've talked about the importance of being an advocate for your members and how to make affordable housing a platform for change for families. But we've got to pause right there. Coming up in part two of my discussion with Adrianne Todman, the CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Adrianne tells us how to bring groups together to find solutions for affordable housing.
We have to expose people to information that they ordinarily didn't care to look at or chose not to have access to. You have to help people vent who are frustrated and who are angry, have a safe place to vent. And then you need to find commonality in terms of what's important.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.